Norway isn't officially part of the European Union, but it might as well be.
Thanks to its membership in the European Economic Area, EEA, Norway enjoys most of the perks of being in the EU, like access to the single market, without being an actual member.
And while that sounds like the best of both worlds, many Norwegians, especially in the major political parties like Labour and the Conservatives, have long supported the idea of joining the EU completely. In fact, Norway has tried to become a full member 4 times, in 1962, 1967, 1972, and again in 1994. But each time something got in the way, either opposition from France's President Charles de Gaulle or a public vote that said no. Despite this, recent opinion polls show growing interest in joining. Just last week, the leader of Norway's main opposition party even said she wants to try applying again. To understand why this matters, let's take a quick look at Norway's long and bumpy road with the EU. Norway's connection to Europe's integration efforts started in 1960, when it joined the European Free Trade Association, EFTA. This group was created as an alternative to the European Economic Community, EEC, the group that would eventually evolve into the EU. EFTA included countries like Austria, the UK, Sweden, and Switzerland, nations that wanted economic cooperation but weren't ready to join the EEC just yet. Back then, people often referred to the EFTA countries as the Outer Seven, while calling the EEC nations the Inner Six. But as European integration became more attractive, many of the EFTA countries, including the UK, Denmark, and Ireland, decided to apply to join the EEC. Norway applied too, following their lead, but their hopes were dashed. French President Charles de Gaulle blocked the applications, twice, because he feared the UK would become a backdoor for US influence, and that expansion would slow down European unity. It wasn't until de Gaulle stepped down in 1969 that the door reopened. The EEC became more open to new members, and Norway joined Denmark, Ireland, and the UK in reapplying. While Denmark and Ireland eventually joined after public approval and referendums, Norway's people voted narrowly against membership in 1972. 53.5% said no. Norway stayed in EFTA but continued inching closer to the EU. In 1994, a major step came when Norway joined the EA along with Iceland and Liechtenstein. This agreement allowed them to be part of the EU's single market, one of the world's largest trading zones, without being formal members. The deal meant Norway had to adopt most EU regulations related to the market, even though it doesn't get a vote on how those rules are made. That same year, the EU expanded again. Austria, Sweden, and Finland all joined after successful referendums. Norway tried again, but once more its people said no, this time by a margin of 52% to 48%. For a long time, Norwegians couldn't make up their minds about joining the European Union. Up until around 2010, public opinion was pretty evenly split. But even then, Norwegian governments mostly stayed quiet about the topic. That's partly because Norway is usually run by coalition governments, and many of the smaller political parties have been firmly against EU membership. So even if some major parties liked the idea, it was too politically risky to bring it up. Then came the Eurozone crisis, and support for joining the EU really took a nosedive. The EU was seen as messy and divided, and many European economies were struggling badly. For Norwegians watching from the outside, the whole situation didn't look too appealing. During much of the 2010s, surveys showed that only about 1 in 5 Norwegians supported EU membership, while around 70% were opposed. Many were worried that as one of the wealthiest countries in Europe, thanks in part to its oil wealth, joining the EU might force Norway to help bail out poorer member states. But that mood started to shift after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Suddenly, the idea of a stronger, more united Europe looked a lot more attractive. Newer polls showed that support for EU membership in Norway jumped to around 30%, with opposition falling to just over half of the population. And that support has kept climbing. The most recent survey by Norstat found that 37% of Norwegians are now in favor of joining, while 43% are still against it. That's the smallest gap in decades, just a 6-point difference. Sure, it's still not a majority, but the momentum is hard to ignore. If this trend keeps going, Norway might soon see more people supporting membership than opposing it. Politicians are paying attention too. Just last week, the leader of Norway's Conservative Party, the main opposition, said in an interview with the Financial Times that they're ready to apply if the opportunity arises. In her words, if there comes a window to apply, we will apply. So what's behind this growing shift in public opinion? One big factor is the changing global landscape. Europe is pulling closer together, especially in response to US President Donald Trump's skeptical stance toward NATO and support for Ukraine. Many Norwegians worry that they can't rely as much on the US for protection, so having a seat at the European table suddenly feels more urgent. But there's more to it than just security. The European Union itself is evolving. It's no longer just a bureaucratic body that makes trade rules and agricultural policies. It's becoming a real geopolitical player, building its own security strategy, coordinating military aid, and shaping foreign policy more actively. That's new territory for the EU, and it's making Norwegians reconsider their position. Right now, Norway already follows most EU rules through the EEA agreement, but it has no vote on those rules and little influence over the big decisions in Brussels. For years, that trade-off seemed fine. Norway got access to the single market but could stay out of thorny political issues, like fishing quotas. But with the EU stepping into a bigger global role, more Norwegians are asking, shouldn't we have a real say in what happens? There's also a growing sense of urgency coming from the Arctic, specifically from Svalbard, a remote Norwegian archipelago located nearly 1,000 kilometers north of Tromsø. It's a sparsely populated area, but geopolitically, it's becoming a hotspot. Russia has been showing increasing interest in the region as part of its broader push for influence in the Arctic. Just last month, Moscow accused Norway of militarizing Svalbard, an accusation that raised eyebrows because it could be used as a pretext for future military action. With the security guarantees of NATO, especially under leaders like Trump, no longer feeling ironclad to many Europeans, Norwegians are now looking at the European Union as another layer of protection. As the EU flexes its geopolitical muscles more than ever before, some Norwegians see full EU membership as the country's best bet to deter potential Russian aggression. But can Norway actually join the EU? Technically, yes. Politically, it's complicated. Right now, the Labour-led government under Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre isn't keen to reopen the debate. They've made it clear that EU membership isn't on the table, for now. So, any serious push for joining the EU would probably have to wait until after the next election, scheduled for September. And until recently, it looked like that might happen. Labour had been sinking in the polls, and their coalition government even collapsed in January over disputes about new EU energy regulations, rules that Norway is expected to adopt through its EEA obligations. The opposition Conservatives were gaining ground and seemed poised to take over. But the political winds have shifted again. Since former NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg returned to Norway's cabinet, Labour has bounced back in the polls. Meanwhile, the Conservatives and their potential coalition partners, including the right-leaning Progress Party, have lost momentum and now trail Labour. Even if the Conservatives win in the future and push for EU membership, the path wouldn't be straightforward. Norway would almost certainly be welcomed by most EU countries, especially since it would be a net contributor to the EU budget. But fast-tracking Norway could ruffle feathers among existing candidate countries like North Macedonia or Serbia, who've waited in line for years. Some member states, like Hungary, could even threaten to veto the process. So is Norway about to join the EU? Not quite. But for the first time in decades, the odds are rising. As the geopolitical climate shifts, and as the EU transforms into something more than just a trade bloc, Norwegians are rethinking their long-standing stance. And if these trends continue, a new EU flag could one day be flying in Oslo too.